was born and raised in Halifax in the year 1931. I was born on number 9, The Square, which is a very historic part of Halifax, down in Woolshops. Woolshops was the lower end of the town where all the working class lived and didn't have a good reputation. The houses on the square were rather elegant, but they were dilapidated. It had had its glory days, shall we say. We lived on the square for 2 years. My grandmother was the tenant, but my father and mother were living with her till they could get a place of their own. So for the first 2 years of my life, I was on the square. John Lister was living up at Shibden Hall for 2 years. He used to come down to the square because his solicitor lived at number 6, the square. So I think that's a direct link, really, a historic link for me with the Lister family. My sister, yes, she was 2 years older than me. We were both born in January. She was born in January 29. I was born in January 31. After that came 4 more sisters. So we were a family of 6 girls, eventually. It takes time to produce 6 children. There were no expectations whatsoever. We were working class, we had to know our place, and we were what you might call a non-aspirational family. By the time I was 3.5, I could actually read fluently for some reason or other. I think it's because we were quite poverty-stricken, and my father was an immigrant Irishman. He came over in the Irish diaspora after the Civil War in Ireland. So my mother, her parents were Irish, but she was born in Halifax. But we had this strong Irish Catholic culture. And one morning I just decided to take myself to school. So when everybody else had gone, so when I was 3.5, I walked up to the top of Woolshops, onto North Bridge, up New Bank, and went into school. And this nun found me wandering in the corridor, and she said, "What are you doing here?" And I just said, "I've come to school." So she said, "Oh, well, now you're here, you better stay." So she popped me in this classroom with my sister, who was already at school. And of course, when we went home for lunch, my mother was frantic, wondering where I'd been all morning. And that was it. I started school at 3.5, and it was St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Junior and Infant School on Portland Road. I was there until I was 11, and then I passed what was known as the 11+. Then from there you could go to grammar school, and apparently I had this very high pass. So I was sent home with a note to show my mother that I had passed the 11+, and I was really excited. I wanted to go to grammar school. I remember she was scrubbing the back doorstep, and I went in full of elation. I've passed. And she was very downbeat about it. She said, "Oh dear, I suppose you'll want to go to college now, and I can't afford, And that was that. And I cried for 3 days, 3 whole days. I remember being curled up on this armchair in the sitting room. I want to go to college. And anyway, eventually, the priest came and the headmistress, the nun from the school, and they said, "You've got to send her because she is so bright." And they said, "The parish will pay for her. We will pay her scholarship, we will pay her travel expenses, her dinner money, and her uniform." So my mother reluctantly, very reluctantly, had to let me go to college. It was St. Joseph's College. Of course, Catholics, we had to go to Roman Catholic College, and that was over at the other side of Bradford. You set off at 7 o'clock in the morning, you took a bus into Halifax, then you caught the bus to Bradford, and then you walked all the way over Bradford City and caught the trolley to take you up to Manningham Lane, and then you walked down a long road, Cunliffe Road, and you eventually got to college at 9. So, and this was at 11 years old. So it was a very arduous travel to get to school. There were quite a few of us went from Halifax. I didn't do well at college for some reason or other. I think my health began to decline. And when I was 13, all children, school children, had to be examined medically. So the doctor would come and sound us all and everything. And there were 600 pupils, girls. And when my examination, when I'd got dressed and everything, he said, I'm going to give you 2 notes now. He says, and you've got to go home now. You know, not the end of the day, you go home now. He said, give 1 note to your headmistress, give 1 note to your mother to take to the doctors. So I thought, well, you do what you're told when you're 13. Yes, so I went to the headmistress and gave her the note. She was a tall nun, Scottish, frightened us all to death. Yeah, but kind. And she looked down from this towering height and she said, what did you have for your breakfast, girl? And I said, I have drip bread and cocoa, sister. And she said, well, there's goodness in the beef. And I thought, what's she talking about, you know? Anyway, she had to let me go home, of course, and I never went back to college. My mother took me to the doctors. The doctor said she has to leave school. You have to send her away somewhere. And I never found out why. Nobody told me. Nobody told me what was the matter with me. So I went to my aunt's at the seaside for 6 months, and the doctor said she hasn't to work, she hasn't to go to school, she has to get up when she wants, and she has to do what she wants. So what was that all about? Yeah. So after that, I never went back to school. So I literally left school at 13 with no educational qualifications. The little village that my aunt lived was by the seaside. It's between Redcar and Saltburn, a little village called Mosk by Sea. It's a lovely place. So I had a wonderful, wonderful time. I was there when it was VE Day, so we had the big party and everything, you know. And then I came home in the summer, and I was only home about a week. And my mother took me down to this shop called Shaw Hardcastle's. They'd been advertising for a clerk, so she got me the job as a clerk. So I was catapulted straight into work, really. And from then on, it was just one job after another, really. Basically, I wanted to go into nursing. And in those days, you didn't have to have any qualifications to go into nursing. As I've said, I had no educational qualifications at all. But when I was 18, I was accepted at Bradford Children's Hospital, and I did about a year there. I always remember the sister tutor took us down. There were about 6 of us on that intake, and she took us down to the morgue on the first morning so that we could see a dead baby, because she said, this is what you're going to have to handle. So for almost a year, I was working on a ward for premature and newborn babies who were ill. But unfortunately, again, my health, I got some sort of skin disease from the disinfectants, and I was allergic to them, so I had to come away. So I went to work in a greengrocer's shop in Guiseley, and the woman who ran it with her husband, well, helped to run it, she was a nurse up at Menston, which was a big psychiatric hospital. And she said to me, why don't you try there to become a nurse, because, you know, you're not dealing as much with the sort of strong disinfectants and that. So I got in there as a psychiatric nurse, student nurse. I didn't last a year there either. I just couldn't do that sort of nursing. It was a horrible place. It was a big old Victorian place, and there were 90 patients to a ward. And when you were on nights, there was just one nurse on nights on your own. It just wasn't what I wanted to do, no. So I came away from there, and then I went back home and took various other sorts of jobs, just anything really that was going, you know. During the war and just after the war, the women were going into what was called directed labour, and they were sent into munitions factories, or they were sent into the land, became land girls. They went on the buses as conductresses. My sister was a conductress at the time, so she said, why don't you come here till you get a different job? So I did, and that's where I met my husband. In those days, every young man had to do 2 years in some branch of the forces, and he wanted to go into the RAF. So he went for his medical, but unfortunately, because he'd worked as a coppersmith during his apprenticeship, he perforated eardrums. They used to have to get inside these big boilers and hammer them, that sort of thing. So he failed his medical. And when he went for his job back, the supply of copper from Zambia had dried up and there was no work. So he came on to the bus job, and that's how we met, in the canteen at the bus depot. When we first got married, we were very poverty-stricken, my husband and I. We got this little cottage. It was like a lodge to a big house, and there was no electricity in it. It was just gas. We're talking now, 1952, yeah? And we just had to light the gas mantles all round. We could have lovely roaring big coal fires, but no electricity, no hot water, an outside toilet. But after the war, they just weren't building houses, so we were lucky to get it. And I said, we could do with having electricity put in this cottage. I'll go on to the landlady. She lived in a big posh house, right at the end, and big grounds, and ask her if she'll put electricity in our cottage. And but she said, oh no dear, I couldn't possibly afford that. So I went back and I spoke to my husband and I said, shall we save up and put it in ourselves? And so we did that. So about 6 months later, I went back and said, would it be all right if we put electricity in? Oh, yes, So we put electricity in. Anyway, she came on to look at it. She said, I'll have to come and see it now that you've got electricity in. So I said, yes, that's fine, come in. And she said, oh, I see. I'm afraid I'll have to put your rent up now because you've got electricity. So, she put our rent up. So if anybody asks me why I'm a socialist, once I started having the family, I had 4 children. So that was a span of about 15 years, really. So I'd taken a job at the local pub as a barmaid in the evenings, just to bring a bit of extra money in. I was there one night, and this young man came in. He was a student at university. And he said to his friends, oh, I'm reading The Doll's House by Chekhov. And I said, don't you mean Ibsen? Which I shouldn't have said in front of his friends. And he said, how do you know you're only a barmaid? I said, oh, yes, I'm sorry. I said, I really shouldn't have said that. And he came back next night and he said, I owe you a pint and an apology. He said that you were right. I said, I'm sorry. I said, yes, I know I was. And he said, well, how did you know? I said, well, I've read all Chekhov and all Ibsen. And he said, what are you doing working as a barmaid? He said, if you were reading Russian and Norwegian playwrights, you're clever. He said, get up to the tech and finish your education. And that autumn, I took his advice. And so I just did 5 O-levels, 2 A-levels. They were an absolute breeze, yes. And I had enough qualifications to get into the civil service. So I worked in the civil service as a tax officer for 8 years. I enjoyed the job, I really did, yes. But the point is that in those days, there was so short of tax officers in London that anybody who wanted to be promoted to the higher grade had to agree to work for 2 years in London. Well, that was fine for the young men and the young women who had no domestic ties. But it was getting to the stage where these young men and women were bringing the difficult cases to me and I was helping them, but I wasn't getting promoted, and they were, which was fair enough for them. But I thought, I'm not sticking here now for the next God knows how many years of my life. Well, by this time, 2 of my children had become diabetic. So life at home, the domestic scene, was rather stressful. My husband fell ill. He was still a bus driver, yeah? And we'd bought this nice big house and everything. And it came to the point where he couldn't work anymore. And I thought, you know what, we can't afford this house. So I sold the house and we rented back onto a council estate. And then I thought, what's all that been about, really? You know, buying property, the big car. And I thought, I'm giving my job up and I'm going to go to university. Started with doing a year in Open University first, and I really loved it. And I thought, I want to go to university proper, I'm not, declaiming the Open University. It's a wonderful establishment, but it sort of ignited, shall we say, this fire. Charles Dickens put a phrase into David Copperfield's mouth in a book, and he said, "The nagging consciousness of faculties unexercised." And that is exactly what had been in my brain, right from failing at school. Like, I could have done better. Why haven't I done better? Yeah, why can't I get on? And I remember that the Penguin brought out a series of books that started right back at Gawain and the Green Knight in English literature, right up to, Virginia Woolf and modern writers. And I thought, I'm going to buy all those books and I'm going to study the key texts. This was before I went to university. Yeah, so I was ambitious that way, all this reading going on in the background. I took a combined honours degree in politics, literature and the history of ideas. I applied to Bradford. I went in 1978 and I finished in 81, I think it was. That was a very political time. I was involved with quite a lot of left-wing politics, And from then I took my PGCE, my Postgraduate Certificate of Education, to become a teacher. And I got a job at Halifax Catholic High, where my kids had gone to school there. I was 50 then, and I thought, I don't have a career ladder in teaching at that age. So I just took supply work, and that's what triggered it off to freelance writing. I thought, it will give me time. You don't have parents' evenings, you don't have to mark things, you don't have to, have all the peripheral stuff that teachers have. So I decided I would try freelance work, and I tried to think of a person that I could write about that was local. And I remembered there being a woman called Anne Lister that lived up at Shibden Hall. I could say the rest is history. I decided this particular afternoon I would go down to the archives and find out about this woman that I'd heard of vaguely called Anne Lister. I got my coat on, got on the bus, went down to the archives, and there was a young Scottish man there. I told him, I said, I understand there's Anne Lister here. She's got a collection of letters in the archives. And he said, did you know she kept a journal? And those 7 words, I think there were 7, unlocked everything that's happened since, really. So I said, no, I didn't know she kept a journal. And he brought it out, and I saw that a lot of it was in a cryptic code. I said, has this code been cracked? Have you got a key? He says, yes, we have. He said, the last John Lister cracked the code. And so he brought a key of the code out. So I photocopied that, and I photocopied 50 pages of the journal, and I took them home, and I began to transcribe. I learnt the code, then I began to transcribe the code, symbol for letter, symbol for letter, symbol for letter. There was no punctuation in the code, no full stops, no capital letters, no indication of where one sentence started. So it's up to the decoder to, first of all, get the letters out. You've strings and strings and strings of letters. And then you've got to decide where a sentence starts, where it ends, where a paragraph starts, where it ends. And from that day on, every week when I finished the teaching on a Friday, I would go down to the archives, photocopy 50 pages, bring them home, and that was my work for the week after I came home from school. So it took me 5 years to work through the whole journal. There was 7,700 pages and 5 million words, a lot of it in code. So I've transcribed all the code, I've read all the journals, And by the end of 5 years, I had the material for the 2 books. Obviously, the thing that hooked me was, why is this woman writing in code? As I began to transcribe the code, I wondered what I would find. And the last thing I expected to find was the fact that she was a lesbian. And she was writing in code mainly to hide her love affairs with women. And she was extremely explicit. And it took me a little while to realise that that was what I was finding. And little clues like, I began to sit with my brother's braces on, hooked to my pantaloons, you know? And I put his waistcoat on, and I thought, she's cross-dressing here. And then I came across superb phrases that she would quote. For instance, I love and only love the fairer sex, and thus beloved by them. My heart revolts from any other love than theirs. And that was very, very intriguing. My thesis was to bring out the truth of Anne Lister's life, because the story behind the concealment, right from John Lister and his friend Arthur Berrell. Arthur Berrell decided to take a couple of the books home one night. He was a school teacher in Bradford, but he was a great friend of John Lister's in every sense of the word, I believe. We do know that John Lister was homosexual, yeah. So when he came back, he was very excited about what he'd found. He said, I think I found a clue in this code. And what Anne had written, she'd written, in God is my, in her ordinary writing, and then 4 symbols, and they could have only been hope. In God is my hope. So they had the symbols for H, O, P, and E. So they set to that night, and by the morning they'd got the full alphabet out. But when they started transcribing it, they were so horrified with what they found, the explicit sexuality, that Arthur Berrell wanted to burn the journals. But John Lister, thankfully for us, was an antiquarian, and he said, no, this is a historic document, and he hid it behind some panels in the walls here. I got this huge manuscript together, and I thought, now what am I going to do with this? And I went again down to the library. I got the Writer and Artist Yearbook out, and I looked down who's going to be the correct publisher for this. This was a truly feminist piece of work, you know. I thought, I don't think this is going to be any good sending it to the more mainstream publishers. And of course, Virago were quite famous by that time because they were reproducing old classics by women writers and intellectual stuff, you know, as well. So I thought, well, I'll take a chance and send it to Virago. Why I didn't get an agent, I don't know, but I didn't. So I sent it, and they immediately came back to me and said, we cannot publish this. It is far too large. You're going to have to take chunks of it out. So I said, okay. I said, well, I'm not going to take any small chunks out. I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift the whole of Anne's Parisian episode in 1824-5, and I'm going to make that into a separate book. So they accepted straight away what the truncated story, if you like, which took us from 1816 to 1824. And then the Parisian book took us from 1824 to 1826 when she inherited Shibden Hall. So I now had 2 manuscripts. So they took the first one and they published it. And then I said, what about the second one? And they said, oh no, we won't be publishing that. What happened then was that a woman called Caroline Davidson, who's written The World of Mary Ellen Best, she approached me. She said, I understand you're writing a work on Anne Lister. She says, well, I'm producing a book on Mary Ellen Best. And Mary Ellen Best was the niece of one of Anne Lister's lovers, Isabella Norcliffe. So there was a link there. So she said, I'd be very grateful if you came across any references to Mary Ellen Best in the work you're doing. Would you let me have them? So I said yes. Anyway, I told her my troubles later about not being able to get the second book published. So she said, I know, we'll publish it for you. And Caroline's parents they ran a small publishing house in London, but they just published cookery books. But they would send their work up to Yorkshire to a printing firm, Smith Settle of Otley. And so she came up and she took me to Smith Settle, and they said, yes, we'll print the book. So I did get the second book out. My first book came out in 1988, and there was the infamous Clause 28 that came out at the same time. That forbade the teaching or the encouragement of any homosexuality in schools, in the education department. You know, it was banned. Teachers hadn't to talk about it, they hadn't to encourage it, they hadn't, you know. So I went to my headmaster the day before and I said, I'm afraid tomorrow I've got a book coming out that is about female homosexuality, lesbianism. I said, and Clause 28 is forbidding anything like that, and I'm a teacher here, so I have to abide by your decision if I can stay or not. And fortunately for me, he was a learned man, he was a classicist, Oxford and Cambridge, and he just said to me, if you have any trouble from staff, parents or children, send them to me. So I thought that was wonderful. And then I gave him, obviously, a copy of my book. And he came back to me a few weeks later and he just said, you've lit a slow fuse. And that term has gone down in the history of all this, that I was the woman who lit the slow fuse. My husband, Bob, was very supportive all the way through. When I said, look, I'm giving my job up and I'm going to university, and he says, whatever you want to do, love. Yes, that's what you want to do. And he became the house husband, you see, yes. So he always had nice hot meals ready for me and things like that. Yes, he was very supportive. And my 4 adult children now are, I think the word is bemused, or was bemused, because you're always just the mother, aren't you? You know, really. My grandchildren, who are now adults as well, and their children are always thrilled if they see my books. And it's, oh, my grandma's got a book in the shop, you know. In research, I did 2 trips to Paris to research for the Parisian book, of course, yeah. I was awarded a £5,000 grant from the Arts Council to research the second book, which was great to get that money, really. And I took a colleague with me who was a French woman born in Paris. She was like me, a supply teacher at school. And we went to this little studio on the left bank, and they collected everything, every picture that had ever been taken of Paris right back in history. They had a wonderful, wonderful archives. But I had to take my Parisian colleague because I couldn't speak French, you see. So we sat in this little studio. My husband was sat in the park opposite, enjoying the sunshine. And I had to ask in English what I wanted for the book, for the pictures for the second book. And Gilbert would translate it, and then, you know, so there were those 2 research trips which were really enjoyable. But then when the books were published, I got invitations to, well, first of all, obviously, Leeds University. We did a day's school there. I did York University, and people started then putting little plays on, which I went to one at York. I went to Cambridge University. I don't think I went very much abroad before Gentleman Jack, but since Gentleman Jack, I've been to Zurich, I've been to Macerata in Italy, I've been to the Free University in Berlin. I got an invitation to go to Warsaw, but I was doing the Berlin one at the time, so I couldn't go to both, unfortunately. and I'm still getting invitations to go abroad, but I don't travel anymore much these days. So unfortunately, I think my European adventures might be over. Sheffield University have awarded me an honorary doctorate, so I'm now Dr. Helena Whitbread. The young girl who was pulled out of school at 13 would never have envisaged in her wildest dreams that she would ever be wearing the decoration of Doctor of Letters. So you can imagine how proud I am. The first film that I was involved in really was called A Skirt Through History, and Philippa Lowthorpe, who was a producer, I think, for BBC Wales at the time, she approached me and said, you know, would I give them some background, etc. And it was Julia Ford who played Anne Lister in that particular film. And the rationale of that series was that a woman of the present had to have resurrected a woman from the past by writing about her, publishing about her. For instance, the next one that came after was the first woman journalist in Fleet Street. You know, so it was that bringing women back from history and getting them into the limelight, really. Then, of course, we came to the Maxine Peake film. That was in 2010. And I was very thrilled because Maxine Peake came to my home for a day. She said, I want to go and meet this woman who knows so much about Anne Lister. And we had a lovely day together. And I was on the set there. They were always drawing on me to come. I gave a few interviews with journalists on the set and that sort of thing. I'd also done the background for a radio drama with Mary Cooper. It was called Such Sweet Possession, and it was the story of Eliza Raine, Anne Lister's first lover. So that was interesting. I was invited to the studios and that, and in fact I was part of the background. We all had to be people talking as if there was a background, you know. And I think I had a cameo in the Julian Ford one as well. So I kept, you know, creeping in there now and again. In 2010, Virago reissued the books and they actually published the second one this time. It was wonderful for me that the second book came out because they hadn't touched it before, and Smith Settle only published 2,500 copies. And then New York University Press published it as well, but the sales were really low, yes. So no, nothing altered much. Gentleman Jack came out in 2019, and the whole picture changed as far as I was concerned. I did realise at the time that the film was based on Jill Liddington's book, so I knew that I would have to take a back seat, as it were. And what surprised me was that, yes, the series was a huge success. And almost immediately, my books then took a huge upward curve. My editor at Virago is a woman called Donna Coonan, and she rang me one day and she said, oh, I thought I'd just give you some news, Helena. I said, what's that? She says, do you know how many books you sold in February before Gentleman Jack came out? I said, no. She said, 69 copies. So I said, oh, that's par for the course, you know. And she said, and now Gentleman Jack's first series has started. She says, and at the end of March, do you know how many copies your book sold? 20,000. So I had years and years of being the only person who was delving so deeply into Anne Lister's life. I had the ambience of Shibden. I had the image of Anne Lister in my mind. I had the portraits, especially the one on the landing upstairs, that fixed in my mind, and it's never really altered. You know, it doesn't matter which actress would play Anne Lister. They all did very, very good representations, but it was always, to me, my image of Anne Lister hasn't really altered that I have in my mind. As a child, of course, my father had brought us here often, every Sunday, when we lived in Woolshops, because he came from Ireland and everywhere was green, a little village. And down in Woolshops, as he used to say, these kids never see a blade of grass, he said. So every Sunday he would bring us up to Shibden Park. But we only went into the park end. I had no knowledge that there was a house up here at all. So I can't ever remember coming to Shibden Hall until I found the Ann Lister journals. It almost feels like my second home. We did put on a little play here once. I think the actress was Nikki Helens, and she took Ann Lister off, and Sally Wainwright helped me. We worked together on that. So that was the one thing we did here. And then when Tony Sharp was here, he used to do a slideshow. He would put the slides on and I would do the talking. So we did quite a number of those. Yeah, I've done 4 or 5 talks here up at Shibden. I was extremely pleased when they decided to put a blue plaque at Shibden, because the blue plaque had gone at York, at the small church where the marriage, as it were, took place. And I was thinking, well, what about Halifax? And then, of course, the blue plaque was commemorated here at Shibden. And then we got the statue in Peace Hall. And then the commemoration of the Stonewall garden, which was beautiful. I love that little patch. So I was very honoured to cut the ribbon for that. These are steps forward, aren't they, to celebrating the life of Ann Lister. I'm absolutely amazed. The enthusiasm, that it generated, and what it's done for Halifax and Shibden, and I think that I contributed to that, and I feel that I've done something for my town, and I'm proud of that. Yes.